Thank you all for joining us here today. We're very excited to have this event with two amazing authors, Rachel O'Dwyer and Georgina Voss. This event is actually a collaboration with Verso Books, where both Georgina and Rachel have published books with, and they today are going to talk about the intersections and the overlaps between a large part of both of their research, which relate to technological infrastructures, systems, and thinking through how money and emotion circulates through them. Right? Good. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Nora.
Thank you, Nora. So thank you so much for being here. I'm just going to introduce the session and what we're going to do and kind of contextualize it a little bit as well. Thank you. So, before we began, I wanted to speak briefly about being here and in the context of all that's happening in the war in Gaza. This festival, Transmediale, is dedicated to asking critical questions about technology. And my work with the book looks at complex technological systems, the ones that are not abstracted, but which are real in the world, and the structures and infrastructure which combine technology, finance, and the intentions of public and private bodies to create scaled effects and terrible harms. Now, our discussion here for the next hour is going to focus on our specific books, on mine, Systems Ultra, and on Rachel's Tokens. But for me, this is also the backdrop of the presence and power of these systems and the necessity of finding ways to approach them. Our discussion takes place here at a festival which, per statement of January 19th, is committed to enabling a space for open conversations and a commitment to international solidarity. I will finish by being clear in calling for a release of hostages, an immediate ceasefire now, and an end to the genocide.
Thanks, Georgina. And just, I suppose, a note that I'll be moderating the closing conversation this evening, which I think is going to be geared towards, I suppose, people speaking, maybe finally having a bit of space to speak about some of the sort of conflicted feelings that they're having about, sort of what it means to sort of participate and try and speak or enact change on the left at this moment in time. So I might withhold my statements until then, if that's okay.
Thank you. So the structure that we're going to take for today, as I said, we have our books. We will each give a reading, one, I think, big reading from each of our books, which we will discuss with each other one by one. And then, if we have time, we will have shorter readings as well that we will also then use to have discussion between us. I should say just a little bit how this panel came about. We are both published with Verso. We have both just written books on complex technological systems and the intersection of those systems and culture. We have the same editor, we have the same publicist. And so I think when Nora kind of made the point that Rachel certainly was going to be here, that it felt like a great point to have a good collaborative conversation with someone who knows how it feels to try and, only with writing, talk about complex systems. No performance, no diagrams, just writing. So we'll say a little bit about that later, but that's the structure that we're going to take. If we just hold the conversation between us, if we run out of time, we'll be around to chat afterwards. But we are here, and we are very, very happy that you are here too. Perfect. So I'm going to open. All right. Yep.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, and we should say that Georgina's book, I was just published last week, but is available with Verso.
The ceilings of the Las Vegas Convention Center are higher than a cathedral, and this week, these halls play host to the largest technology event on the planet. It is the heart of winter in the Nevada desert, and CES, formerly known as the Consumer Electronics Show, has landed in the biggest building the self-proclaimed entertainment capital of the world has to offer. Visitors may have arrived via a monorail swooping above the city's battered freeways and sweeping around glassy hotels, experiencing a preemptive touch of the future before being delivered to the doors of the center. Frosted sunlight streams through glass walls into a colossally bright atrium, and if you're here for the first time, maybe you feel a ripple or a trill of excitement as you traverse up and down the array of escalators and gentle carpeted slopes and wonder, What delights and wonders of the new technological world await within? Well, buckle up, because what's inside is underwhelming and confusing. This is not your beautiful future. The halls are demarcated into what are meant to be distinct zones, but have such a similar feel that the overall effect is one of a fungal colony of car dealerships, or sprouting nests of airport duty-free booths, where little nodes of brightly coloured widgets have budded, perched on little plinths. Repeat visitors know to bring comfy shoes to cushion their feet as they hike through miles and miles of a terrain of hype in search of the next big thing. But through the forest of stands, it is very hard to ascertain what or where that might be. It is a challenge to make a spectacle to market something as tiny as a microchip or as immaterial as a new software platform, but everyone seems to be scared into using the same colour palettes and shapes. The curves are all the same. A visitor at the 2022 show is bathed in a vaporwave sea of soft lights in pinks, greens and purples, regardless of whether they're inspecting Singaporean gaming hardware or a tunnel built by the world's richest man. Something like the Google Assistant slide at the 2020 show, where attendees clutching backpacks of corporate swag slide from on high into a ball pool, makes for good photos but is utterly untethered to what the technology itself does. As you yomp through the halls, you will pass hundreds, thousands of stalls where eager vendors in branded polo shirts are ready to make their sell on their thing. A car, a phone, a tractor, a screen, some software, a shoe, a digital cockpit, a dog collar, a door handle. Deep down, you know that these are distinct entities, and yet, in the cavernous halls, your heart and brain jacked up by tankards of coffee, everything here is collapsed into the same inchoate mass. There are no existential questions about the identity of the trifecta of trade shows that come to Vegas later in January. 1 week after CES has packed up and left town, concrete, guns, and pornography come to take its place. And each industry is extremely secure in who they are. Agricultural machinery takes over the convention centre as the building is repurposed for World of Concrete. No question here for the construction industry about its selfhood, as it fills the halls with gigantic machines and scaffolding. Across the road is the SHOT Show, a fully functional acronym for shooting, hunting and outdoor trade, whose vendors are pretty comfortable too with what they offer. No big surprises here among a swell of camo aesthetics. Here's guns, there's ammo, here's the FBI offering leaflets on economic espionage, there's crystal manufacturer Swarovski, who make both glittering earrings and rifle scopes. And further south is the Adult Entertainment Expo, where in one hall, performers take selfies with fans, and in another, vendors sell adult novelties. By necessity, the sex industry has always been self-aware of who they are and how they are perceived, and the only attempts to disguise themselves come through the discreet offerings, such as an elegant pastel green vibrator shaped like a stingray, although this is on show next to a vibrator that looks like a larger, angrier version of the body part that it's modelled on. In theory, CES could comfortably envelop guns, concrete and porn. Electronics and code have been seeping into everything for over 50 years, with networked connectivity now attaching everything to everything else. CES has indeed spread. What used to be a tractor is now a cyber-physical entity that farmers can lease and never truly own. The paranoia of the gun show has been augmented by software threaded into smart security cameras. So it's easier to create a narrative for a thing than around the strange interconnection of things. And historically, these theatrics were what CES excelled at. In its earlier years, during the 60s and 70s, the show was a more coherent and elegant affair. But as electronics seeped into everything and software ate the world, the boundaries softened and blurred. Helicopters were on show at CES in 2018, and asked by a Wired journalist whether these vessels could be considered consumer electronics, a vice president of Bell Helicopters replied breezily, "Sure." So perhaps it's not surprising that CES is a hot mess of a Friday casual hellscape, a city superimposed onto a city. It's a long way from the original world fairs of the 19th and 20th century that aimed to offer a coherent vision of a better future that was thematically tied to whatever the show's theme was, even if that theme was celebrating the construction of the Panama Canal. The only canal around here is the artificial one in the Venetian Hotel, where crypto bros set up shop under the unreal sunset to flog imaginary currencies. Across town, someone else has connected a bathroom mirror to a server. And maybe this is inevitable. How could anyone create an understandable story which ties together, say, the fabric of a device and its tiny embedded sensors that track heart rate and location, and embedded software that crunches this data to determine habit and behavior, and the server farms that collect and collate this material through environmentally intensive processes, and any ethical and political considerations around any single part of this process, let alone how all these moving parts intersect with each other? And this is all for a smart dog collar, by the way. In the light of increasingly complex network technologies and phenomena such as climate change, there has been a growing rumble of calls for a new kind of systems literacy, not to treat these strange entanglements of nodes and connectors as definable things, but to create a fundamentally different way to know them. Writing about the emergence of complex information systems, James Bridle makes a call for an urgent understanding of these systems and their ramifications, but everyone agrees that finding a vocabulary for these assemblages is a challenge. Systems, Donella Meadows writes, are structures defined by relations, with parts that stand together and relate to the whole, and are thus notoriously difficult to articulate in writing. They cannot be described in neat, linear ways, but through a language that shares some of their properties. And the philosopher Timothy Morton goes further, describing certain types of sprawling complex systems as hyperobjects, such as the internet and climate change, that exist through space and time. They are difficult to approach, hard to conceptualize, emerging and submerging through our limited human consciousness. But there is a very human hand at play on the show floor, though, which shapes how these man-made systems are not only built, but known. As we've seen, CES should theoretically be easily able to engulf guns, sex, and construction into its maw, but these categories have minimal presence at the event. Military funding underpins the technological functioning of nearly everything on show, but there's no specific category for firearms or defence products. Vehicle tech does have its own area, but a lot of what's on show is closer to vaporware than fully functional machines. And then, sex. In 2019, an elegant vibrator made by Laura DiCarlo, visually indistinguishable from many of the other, tamer, rubbery, white curved devices on show, won the honorary designation of the robotics and drones category at the Innovation Awards. Although sex tech has been at the show for a while, the Consumer Technology Association, which runs the award, freaked the hell out and revoked the prize. After a flurry of complaints, the award was reinstated and sexual health devices were allowed to compete for the prize the following year. But the whole shebang exemplified how weird CES gets around sexuality and gender. Despite giving rise to the accursed form of booth babes, the women and sometimes men, who augment the show's atmosphere with ambient vibes of attraction and seduction, CES is really quite uncomfortable with the actual erotic, banning products which it deems to be immoral, obscene, indecent or profane. Systems do not just happen. Those on show at CES may be constructed materially, but their comprehension is culturally reinforced. By the show's end, feet aching, caffeinated into the sun, trapped in the swell of several thousand lanyarded attendees, and staring at what describes itself as a smart door, you may ask, truly, what the hell is going on?
Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed reading Systems Ultra, but particularly that introduction. It's so evocative, and sort of going into the trade show, and the trade show as sort of a research site, I think is something that's really, really interesting, and actually something we have in common, because I actually visited Money 2020 in Las Vegas. So I don't know, the whole way through the book, I was really interested in these sort of definitions that you have of systems, and obviously systems as structure plus behavior, which I think you mentioned there, and I've just taken my thumb out of my notes actually, but I don't know, you gesture as well, so well in the introduction, I suppose, to the difficulties of writing about systems, you're pointing to sort of the limits of what the writing can do. And I kept thinking of this like quotation that comes up sometimes for, I think it's writing about music, it's like writing about music is like dancing about architecture. And I kind of wondered for you, like what was writing about systems like? I mean, was it just a total headfuck, or, did you get to a point where you were like, actually, this is how you make something so amorphous and huge knowable? Or did you just never get there?
I think, we'll get onto this. The hardest chapter, definitely, and we've talked about this, was one of the chapters is about money, and the money chapter was the nightmare chapter. I'd started with the conditions where, as Donella Meadows writes, that, it's very hard to just write about systems without using a diagram, and that had kind of been my challenge for the book. And some of it had come from, to be honest, from teaching and lecturing, particularly when your subject matter is something that either people can meet with incredible hostility or just absolute boredom. I think I was saying to you before, a long time ago, many years ago, a lot of my teaching started off with teaching engineering ethics. And this wasn't to kind of interested philosophy students who were thinking about, the world of technology. This was to engineering students who did not want to be there. They could have been in the lab, they could have been making things, they could have been soldering things, and instead they had to come to a lecture hall for an hour to hear about Immanuel Kant. And met with the absolute hostility of several hundred engineering students. I think, as anyone's taught knows, there's a point where it becomes performance. You have to get the information across, but it has to be conveyed in a way that is accessible and, if not even entertaining, but you can't just stand there and rant, because that will be the point where everyone turns off and you're like, no, this is really incredibly important, because some of you probably want to get jobs, maybe wherever you're going to get jobs, and also technology is political. So there's definitely been that point of thinking about how do you convey that part of it in a way that's kind of almost designed to be read out loud, I think. But also it is, a friend of mine who, several friends of mine who have, seen over the years the work that I've done on what are functionally quite boring things. There's always something interesting. That was, again, anyone, I'm sure, in this room knows, that even, the day-to-day life of engaging with swearing at, software programs, or trying to go and visit a large industrial site. There's always something there. It's not bland, and it was finding and thinking about those bits as the kind of way in, I think. But the money chapter was a nightmare. The money chapter, which I'll read, if we've got time, I'll read from a little bit. Part of it is talking about payment processes and credit cards. And I remember sitting in a cafe with a pen and paper, drawing diagram after diagram of how credit cards work between payment processes and people, and where financial risk moves. And I was on the point of emailing our editor, being like, Leo, we've said no pictures, but there may be just one picture in this, which is a very boring picture of a credit card diagram. And then by the end, I was like, no, I think we can describe this.
So actually, just out of curiosity then, so you said to me very early on, that you had this restraint about no diagrams, which I find kind of surprising, because you have such a strong, design and visual element to your work. Was that a constraint that was kind of imposed on you by the publisher then? Or something you imposed yourself? And if so, why? Why no diagrams? Why no visual aids?
Because it felt like that would be cheating. It felt like if we are trying to, for me, if you're trying to do a thing where, again, there's been the starting conditions of complexity is you can understand it visually, and we're struggling to convey complexity, that it felt like it had to be only writing. That even to have images in it, there's that relationship between text and the image of kind of the thing that you're pointing to, of that's my picture of a fully automated seaport in Rotterdam. And it felt like the language had to do the heavy lifting. If I could get the language to do the heavy lifting, then we'd be going somewhere.
I actually, I ended up in Money 2020 because I met this group of anthropologists who go there every year. So their research is they go to financial trade shows and they kind of immerse themselves in that environment to kind of understand how the industry constitutes itself. So that is their research, that's their field work, is they go along and they watch Peter Thiel give a talk about cookies for the real world. And they see, what's the kind of language that's happening, what are the stories that are being told there, how are crypto bros kind of hanging, they go and hang out in the strip club afterwards, and what sort of conversations are sort of happening in this space, what is the free swag, and actually I had a similar situation like 7 years ago where I was trying to write a paper about payments, and also was like, oh, maybe I'll try to draw a diagram of this because it's really, really complicated. And I was trying to show like how data was gathered at different points in a payment system. And I was talking to Bill Maher, and he said, instead of actually trying to describe this at every moment, like, why don't you tell a story? And he said, when I want to explain the complexity of money to people, I don't talk about money in like really global terms. I ask people to describe how they paid for their wedding. And then similarly, we decided, instead of me trying to kind of explain, what happens when somebody goes up and uses their smartphone to pay, that I could make a little story about a girl going into a store like Amazon Go and buying a Coke, and what would and what sort of happens in that particular moment. But I just thought that was really interesting. Like stories.
And I think there was definitely something there with which I think this is probably a nice lead into your reading as well. But the other thing I was really interested as well was the experience of systems, like as a kind of there's a lot of the kind of systemic knowledge or engagement from the 21st century, the 20th century, comes out of cybernetics, and it comes out of a very kind of command and control type reading. If you can just get the diagram right, if you can just map it out, you can control the system. And what that doesn't do very much is from the experience of what it's like to be inside it, or the experience of like moving within this thing. And it was that experiential part that I was really interested in, but also particularly that that tension which anyone knows, and the difference between trying to particularly engage with something digitally and all the hacks and the workarounds to actually just make it work. That those are different things. But I think at this point I'm going to ask, can I just ask you one more question, actually, which kind of relates to that, because what I find really interesting about this work is it feels like it's kind of like a written not antidote, accompaniment, whatever that word is, to a lot of like artistic practice that's about sort of making systems visible or knowable in different ways. And it really then made me think of there's an essay by Shannon Mattern called Infrastructural Tourism that I share with my art students every year. And this paper talks about different works that visualize complex infrastructures, but she sort of ends with this quite confronting question where she sort of says, okay, well now we understand the system may be better through this artwork, but she sort of confronts us with this question, okay, we know, we've made the strange more knowable now, so what? And she sort of also asks, if anything, is there a danger that when we make something more noble, that we actually kill the strange, or we almost depoliticize it? And I wondered, obviously that's a slightly provocative question, but I wondered how you thought about this idea of making things more knowable. Is it always a good thing? I think, there was definitely that point of the making the invisible visible, I think, which she talks about so much of. And I think, the history to that, I think, for her essay is kind of, she goes back and says, like, you've got a very long history of people talking about political and infrastructural systems and bringing them out to the forefront, but you have also particularly the system now where we do have wireless connectivity, where we do have things which now just work, here, but they're black boxed and they deal with kind of a very immaterial infrastructure. So when we talk about that, it's like in part of it, an element of its first principles is trying to drag that thing kicking and screaming and being like, it's data centers, it's towers, it's that part of it. So to at least just bring that into the world. I think the kind of what you do with it next, I don't know, I like how her essay ends of like, is it discussion? Is it something that you have that kind of at least awareness in the world of? Is it the starting point for a more collective form of action around that as well? Does it move through that? But I would agree that it's like to simply document and make something visible doesn't necessarily politicize it. And I think there was that part of, I told you that a talk I had last week, someone asked me of the book, if you're talking about systems and infrastructure and supply chains, is this the kind of the Tim Cook like world of like the distributed object? And I think one of the things I'd wanted to do with this was to get, it's structure and behavior, it's intent, it's the political part of it. And so finding ways to kind of bring that part out, which aren't just that diagrammatic thing of node, connector, movement, that like
what is it? Somebody called it the loveliness of stuff, or
exactly. But to be like, no, there's actually there are the unexpected things, what Donella Meadows calls the surprise of systems. But there's also the intent that runs through it and the larger mega structures that it runs on. But I've talked a lot, so I'm
No,
going to ask
you haven't at all, actually. I actually just pulled the bit I'm going to read onto my laptop because I realised. Yeah. I don't know whether it's going to run away tech. So this is just a little extract from a chapter. I might just have to pull up my reading and then play it again. Sorry. Okay. Hopefully I can have them both up at the same time. Maybe I can't, actually. Let's see. To play her like this. I'll just play it like that. So I just wanted to have it in the background. It's just an example of one of the videos I was looking at. So this is just an extract that's a little bit about Twitch bits and Twitch tokens and Amazon wish lists, actually. So, hi everyone, was wondering what you ladies put on you Amazon wish list sick for OnlyFans. I want ideas, smiley face. I spend a lot of time looking at these Amazon wish lists during work hours. I make a post-it on the desktop. My husband reads from it incredulously one morning. Black feather whip, animal ears, yogurt, how to win friends and influence people, Michael Kora's clutch. The gifts on the Amazon wish list begin to soft focus until they all look like the same woman. On OnlyFans and Chatterbait, there's a lot of makeup, uncomfortable looking shoes and underwear, headbands with animal ears. And interspersed with these obvious costumes, there are more pragmatic pieces of activewear, form-fitted leggings and sports bras that feel like they might be worn in the streamer's downtime, but which may also be costumes. On Twitch, maybe in a nod to the geekier audience, the wish for items skew more towards quirky gaming and World of Warcraft. There's quite a bit of home decor, presumably to furnish the streamer's set. Things like throw pillows and strings of LED lights of the kind that you might see strung up in a teenage girl's bedroom. They're domestic props that feel personal, hinting at, if not exactly a rich interior life, then at least a glimpse of something authentic. But they're also universal enough to have a broad appeal, to feel like an IKEA showroom, as though a basic set of protocols has been carefully skewed to produce the effect of a real domestic interior, of a real interior life. There's a dream catcher, a print that says, coffee strong, lashes long, hustle on. One item in particular catches my eye. It's an LED sign in a dusky pink that says, do what you love, in modern font. Some wish for the technical equipment designed to light and produce a stage set, like ring lights, tripods, webcam stands. The list of wishes and wants is a mixture of what Irving Goffman called the front and the backstage, although, like the yoga pants, it's hard to say where the real stuff ends and the performance begins. Some of the gifts are here because patrons want to buy them, or at least imagine buying them, while others are part of the practical business of producing and editing an online stream. There's the occasional book. One of my lists from a Chatterbait streamer calling herself Sweet Ari includes How to Win Friends and Influence People, directly underneath The Automatic Millionaire and A Beginner's Guide to Crypto Assets. Sweet Ari has also earmarked a Dogecoin mousepad. There are lots of wants and wishes, but very few basic needs. There are lots of cat toys and treats, but only very occasionally children's clothes or toys. In my experience, it's rare to find something that points outside to the practical business of domestic care and maintenance. I see a cordless vacuum cleaner, but it's an aspirational Dyson. Once a jumbo pack of paper towels. But mostly the items exist in a fantasy world. The business of turning flammable underwear into cash or groceries happens backstage. And then there are the gift cards for popular stores like Amazon, Sephora and Starbucks, picked for their high liquidity. Let's see if I can just switch over to another video. On message forums, streamers discuss the fine art of wish list curation. What's an acceptable gift to ask for? What is too practical? What is too much? What do patrons prefer to buy? What are some good ways of turning the gift into a payment without seeming too mercenary or calculating? What sites are best for selling gift cards at cost? Tokens negotiate the tender boundaries between markets and online authenticity. Tokens, as something that is not quite money, can temporarily shrug off the transaction. But equally, they are part of the work of keeping these things, online work and online play, friendship and business, separate. The token draws a line between the business of getting paid and the business of doing what you love. In the 1970s, feminist Marxist theorist Sylvie Federici penned a manifesto called Wages Against Housework. I show my students images of the campaign, women with centre partings and high-waisted jeans marching below a banner. For Federici, the fact that women's work in the home was so often framed as a labour of love hid its significance to capitalism. Demanding a wage pulled the veil off the assumption that some forms of work, like childcare or homemaking, were natural to women. To demand payment is, in Federici's words, to refuse that work as the expression of our nature, and therefore to refuse precisely the female role that capital has invented for us. The banners say wages for housework, but Federici's essay replaces for with against. The money isn't really what's at stake, in other words, but demanding a wage brings this invisible labour into a market where it can be seen as work and, more importantly, refused on those terms. Nearly done. Writing of the earmarking of domestic money, Viviana Zellitzer also explored controversies surrounding married women's allowances in the 20th century. Women's money often had a special vocabulary that set it apart from ordinary cash, known as pin money, egg money, pocket money, butter money, or dole. There were also difficulties negotiating the transfer of money from husband to wife. Should the money a husband gave to his wife be a payment, an entitlement, or a gift? The payment, Zellitzer writes, implied something too close to a working transaction. In fact, paying a wife was illegal since it made her a menial and a servant in the home, where she should discharge marital duties in devoted and loving ministrations. Framing it as an entitlement, something she was due, conferred a dangerous power and independence. The gift finally implied subordination and precarity. It was subject to someone else's whims and inclinations. In upper and middle class households, Zellitzer writes, women rarely handled cash, but instead relied almost entirely on invisible dollars, crediting their expenses, and sometimes had to resort to asking and cajoling and begging for additional cash. If this failed, there were always other underground tactics, from home pocket picking to padding bills, such as getting a dressmaker to send a bill for an inflated sum and pocketing the excess. I have an awkward conversation with my mother, married in 1966, 3 weeks after her 20th birthday. Your father decided that £5 a week would do it. That was to pay for my food Monday to Friday. I check it later with an online inflation calculator. It amounts to just less than €120 in today's money. She lapses into calculations based on the pre-decimal system. The bus from Dublin cost 19 and 6. And what about clothes and things like that, I ask. Well, sometimes he was paid in postal orders and he would give them over to me to cash in. Those were for clothes and children's toys, days out, treats, that kind of thing. The conversation hitches and stalls, as it often does with money and family. It feels intrusive. It feels too on the nose. By asking about money, I'm asking her to sketch the power dynamics in her early marriage. But what if you needed something? I hedge. What if you just wanted something? Your dad was always very generous. She doesn't quite answer. He always bought me things to make life easier for me. She recites the 1960s housewife's ultimate wish list. I had a dishwasher before any of my friends, hostess trolley, microwave, tumble dryer. Wait, I nearly forgot the fur coat. Like our conversation, the token was indirect, a contract, wrapped up in a diamond. It skirted the issue. Money threatened the performance. It showed the backstage. Without a wage, the fantasy of doing what you love can be maintained. Sorry, that feels a lot longer than, when you read it. Anyway, I'm done. I love that bit. I remember reading that bit of moving between the kind of
the online wish list and getting to your mother, like the housewife wish list, and just being like, oh my goodness. My question for you was kind of similar. I think at both a big and then a targeted bit. You came out of visual arts and I think sound production as well, and work on radio frequencies. Where did money come in? Did that come from the more like immaterial that then got fed through, or was it something else? And the second part that fits with that, which I've been thinking about, which you kind of brought through beautifully, was again the front stage and the backstage stuff, which I love from Goffman, but kind of again where that sat in the work and at what stage that kind of moved into it to help you think through it.
So I got really interested in money in about 2012 or 2013 because I was involved in kind of open source radio and open source Wi-Fi. And I guess through that then there were sort of mumblings about Bitcoin, on mailing lists like NetTimes. So sort of aware of Bitcoin on the one hand, as this sort of open sourcing of money. And I think there was a paper by Jaramil or Dennis Roy, who, writes a lot about free and open source software, that was published, I think, around 2012, 2013, I want to say, where he sort of argued that the financial crash had broken the taboo on money. And that, and obviously, we probably think very differently now, but it seemed at that particular moment that there was a sort of proliferation of alternative currencies, experiments with cryptocurrency, and that these seem to sort of follow a bit of a through line with previous work around things like free and open source software and around open source hardware and community wireless networks. So it was a bit of that, but also because I was really interested in mobile networks and open sourcing mobile networks, and I was trying to build an open source mobile network in Dublin, I came across a huge payment system called M-Pesa, which I hadn't heard of. And, we probably all are familiar with M-Pesa now, but if anyone isn't, M-Pesa is like the biggest mobile payment system in the world, and it sort of emerged in a very, I guess kind of grassrootsy sort of a way where, in response to hyperinflation in places like Zimbabwe in the early 21st century, where people didn't have access to coinage, they started using phone credit as a de facto means of payment. So people were sending each other phone credit as a form of payment instead of using it as talk. And because I was interested in, radio spectrum and sort of how radio spectrum was enclosed, I was like, whoa, this is like airtime is money, and, mobile network operators are the new banks. And that is basically how I got into money. And then the kind of Irving Goffman, obviously, I teach digital culture in an art college, so I'm obliged to teach things like Goffman, so to my students we talk about self-presentation online and, how this book that was written in the 1950s maybe applies to, how they construct their identities through selfies. But I was looking at this woman on Twitch, actually, who was getting ready to perform. And she looked about my age, she wasn't in the first flush of youth, shall I say. But she was kind of getting ready to do a performance with in a hot tub. So Twitch kind of flirts with the boundaries of acceptable adult content. So if you are you can be dressed in a bikini if you are in a paddling pool, like the kind you might blow up on a hot day in the summer. And so she was blowing up a ring toy. But it was sort of unclear whether that was part of the performance or part of the business of getting ready to perform. She was kind of provocatively angled towards the camera, so she was sort of jiggling while she was blowing up the pool toy. And I don't know, something about the arrangement of that. I was learning the kind of vernacular of Twitch, and it made me think about that moment of like the backstage and the front stage, and sort of the economy of the girl within something like Goffman, which I don't think he was thinking about when he wrote that. No.
Irving Goffman has many good things to say about stigma, but perhaps not in the modern context. I guess also that's super interesting about the radio mobile phone link, which now you say it's like, of course, that's kind of like, big red string diagram of like that's how it all comes together. I guess a similar question that you've just asked me, when you're thinking about as we talked a little bit about yesterday, these systems that have these very immaterial aspects to them, and particularly against hard cash and metalism, but also have these very specific aesthetics and visual forms and cultural things. How did you kind of find your way weaving those together? Kind of, did you find your way moving or trying to explain or having to think through complex immaterialities, or did you have a grounding and this is how they're playing out, and then we'll kind of move back from there?
I just really wanted to tell interesting stories, because I don't like a lot of academic writing, and I don't want it to feel like an effort to read. And then, so I remember in the book proposal having that as being kind of the thing I foregrounded, was whatever way this falls out, I definitely, I want it to be kind of grounded in more stories of things, or I don't know, I find particular examples interesting, and maybe sometimes objects, or I think artworks are really fruitful for thinking about money as well. I think a lot of what artists do with money is actually really useful. And I found this is an object I have at home, which is, it's like a brick of shredded euros from the central bank. But I think there's something about that object even that is really, evocative. I wrote about it a little bit. The guy apparently who gave it to me, his daughter uses it as bedding for her guinea pigs because it's absorbent. And I just love the idea of these really bougie guinea pigs,
rolling around in money.
Yeah, exactly. That's probably not answering your question, but maybe I could ask you a question in return, which was, again, I kind of wanted to ask you about research, or research methods, and how you thought about, the kind of going into these sorts of do you think about going into, so your book is structured, I should say, Georgina's book is structured in these discrete chapters, and each one has a title. One is called Legacy, there's Deviance, and they're all sort of different ways of looking, or different ways of slicing the system or coming at the system. But as well as that, they're also discrete case studies, which take place kind of in different sites where you've clearly done extensive sort of field work. I was just really curious at how you think about sort of that as sort of a method, or how do you describe that as sort of a research method, or how do you talk about that as doing research?
Oh man, so it's probably worth then giving context to how it came together. I had done a lot of projects around technology and politics, and art, and each one of them had dealt with kind of a slightly different thing. I'd done several works on airspace. I'd done a lot of research on the pornography industry. There had been work on car crashes. There had been many things, and each from those projects. I'm sure, again, this is familiar to many people here. If you're making whether it's a particularly creative project, you do a lot of research, you do a lot of work, and then some of that might be the aesthetics, the material form, the kind of how on earth is this thing going to render in time? But there's the other side of it too. And at the end of it, you have the project, or you have the thing, the installation, the performance, the kind of whatever it is, and then you have this extra kind of that basically, or the other stuff. And there was kind of, it felt like a very much all the parts of the animal. I've got all this stuff and I want to do something with it, and I've already done something with it, but there's more that I'm not saying here. So I hadn't come into this thinking I was going to do it, which I possibly a strange way of writing it, but I hadn't come into this thinking I'm going to approach a subject that is going to be brand new to me. It's I already had these 6 quite chunky areas that I wanted to look at, and I wanted to do a bit more kind of digging into things, and I wrote this over the pandemic, which meant that being able to go to places got shut down quite quickly. So the final chapter, which is on, well, I'm not going to spoil it, but it's on breakage, originally had a slightly different framing. I think actually the first chapter wasn't originally going to be about CES so much, it was something else, but that had to be constrained. But I had all the stuff. I had loads of notes. I had email chains. I had 1,000 million photos, which I had taken on my phone over the years. And there was extra reading, and that was kind of the starting point, almost to kind of interrogate it again, but also, I think, as you said, to try and pull out the stories and the narratives, and also the process of I think for nearly all the chapters, the process of doing something in it, of not just, although with no disrespect to travel writing, but not just travel writing of going to somewhere and being in that space and exploring it, but the process of doing something in that space, even if it was something like trying to gather research to make a multimedia installation. Like there's something in that process of doing which meant that by its nature you are getting into the weeds with something. I have no idea how to describe this as a research method. I'm not sure I necessarily would, but it felt like a good jumping off point to kind of again circle back to all these things and also just try and find. Like I had known it was, it'd been a bunch of different technologies, a bunch of different spaces. It wasn't like doing research on, oh my goodness, telegraphy or work with 3D printing for years and years. It was like they were all very, very different things. So trying to find like what was the binding principle, and the binding principle was like the systemic nature of them, and that was kind of where it came from. But then again, being able to write about them in a way that was hopefully that would hit the ground running, I think, as well. That would be funny, and that you could, come into it and be accessible to.
I actually launched a book on systems in the summer for somebody, or I did like an interview with a colleague of mine who wrote a book about systems. And one of the questions I asked him, possibly because I was reading pages for him during the pandemic, was like, what was his experience of writing a book during the pandemic like? And I don't know if that's quite a personal question, but
it was fairly terrible. I absolutely wouldn't recommend it. I think that with the world kind of going on outside and then trying to get enough, I remember seeing things of people being like, well, we're all locked down, so surely this is the time you write your magnum opus, you get down. It's like, no, this is the time for staring at the wall. This is absolutely the time for staring at the wall and having not very much brain energy to do it. I think, so hauling it together was an effort, and under different, would have been written probably much, much more quickly under different circumstances, but that was kind of what we had. But I was going to ask, how did it feel for you to kind of pull all these things together? And was it for you the new original research, the kind of finding your voice in it as well, or did it feel different from other types of writing that you'd done?
I really enjoyed writing it, because I think one of the nice things about working in an art college maybe is that you get to do slightly more experimental kinds of writing. I don't exactly know like what the situation is like in Germany in terms of the academy, but I think in Ireland anyway, we were not subject maybe to the same kind of pressures in terms of the ref system as some European places, but in particular in the art college, I think you can really get away with kind of doing whatever you want, and there's drawbacks to that. Obviously, we've like less research funding and less research time and all of that, but I think you also have this kind of space to do more work. I don't know, maybe it's like really messy, but like I suppose I wrote it after the pandemic, and my son actually got very, very sick when I was writing it, so I had a sabbatical to write, and he was diagnosed the week that actually I started writing it. And I've actually never talked about that in the context of a book talk, but because we were talking, I suppose, about our experience of writing it, it sort of seems to make sense. So I didn't do anything on it for like 3 months, and then I sort of came back to it, and it was really nice because it was kind of like a space to do something when that felt very overwhelming, weirdly. So I really, really, weirdly, maybe it sounds really sociopathic, I really actually kind of enjoyed writing it, because it was like somewhere to put your brain, when everything felt too kind of overwhelming in real life. So I actually wrote like chunks of it in the hospital with him, and did like even doing stuff like doing the research on the, like reading all those stupid like even this like the kind of Twitch stuff, or like reading weird like forums from the extropians from the 1990s. It's like kind of slightly mindless work, and it's the kind of thing you can do in a hospital in the middle of the night and gives you something to do. So I think it probably sounds really weird to say that like the experience was really like kind of weirdly joyful, but it actually was. It was really nice to do. But I think Verso is so nice that way, kind of has that freedom for like different kinds of writing as well.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
I was going to, I was also mindful of time. I was going to briefly, hustle on this point, it's a book launch. One of the other projects I did with the writing, which I have now for anyone around afterwards, was working on a bookmark project with a colleague of mine.
There's some here actually that you gave me, if you want that.
So I with my colleague Paul Bailey, because the book is only text, but we also wanted to find ways of reading, he created a series of bookmarks, which I have here, called Insert, Avert, which are made in response to the book. So as a kind of a way to kind of introduce a different form of reading in. So I have those, and I'll briefly be around afterwards with a stash of them. I think grossly, again, underestimated how many people would be here, but I do have quite a large box of them if anyone would like to take one. And also holographic stickers, because it felt like, again, if you're writing something in quite a dry way, it was just like, we'll just have the little kind of like rave scene holograph stickers of maritime infrastructure as an extra kind of add-on to come with it. So I have a bag of those too. But I think we're in the last 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So what I was going to do that terrible question of like, why this book? Why now? You know, the kind of the one they ask you when they, you know,
I don't know.
why do you care about
that.
money and tokens, Rachel? Like, what is that? What is that now?
Oh, don't ask me that, seriously, please. No. Sorry. Why did I write it now?
Yeah, why?
No, I've been interested in it. Like, I actually found I have those really like physical notebooks, you know, like this one actually, and I found plans for a book called Tokens in ones that are like 7 or 8 years old, that looked very like this. So I think I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I'd actually kind of forgotten. So I wanted to write a book about something that is money but isn't money, so stuff that's money-ish, and if anything, actually I kind of hate that it came out now, because I feel like there's so much kind of annoying discourse maybe around crypto, and even like, you know, I did one or two like launches like in the States where it was like the crypto book, you know, and yet actually like only a tiny bit of it is actually really anything to do with crypto. Most of it's about like things like butter vouchers, you know, or like social welfare payment, program payment, and you know, all the kind of workarounds that exist, I suppose, from below for people to sort of use things that look like money but aren't quite, as a way to be deviant within the system, as you explore so well within your book. But also then how those sorts of those kind of sleights of hand are also used, you know, by platforms and by the state as well, to sort of control and to program and to regulate behaviour. So if anything, I mean, it's topical now. So, you know, like, it's topical because of like Sam Bankman-Fried. It's topical. I mean, maybe the question is like, why crypto now? Why are people so interested in crypto now? And maybe we talked a bit about that yesterday. I think the reason why did, like, this technology has been around for 10 years. Crypto has been around for 10 years. NFTs even have been around since 2014. Why did they suddenly become so popular during the pandemic? For me, a lot of that was to do with this sort of sense of crisis, or, you know, this absence of the good life, that a lot of people were super anxious, that there wasn't sort of a clear pathway to financial security. And so, you know, the sort of push towards things like retail trading and crypto, where they were sort of sort of a response to that kind of financial nihilism in some ways, where, you know, if you can't see kind of a clear pathway to that, it's sort of the Lambos or food stamps kind of thing. You know, if there's no clear pathway to the good life, there's no clear pathway to home ownership, you may as well YOLO all your money into an NFT. And yeah, I had a video of like the metaverse ad, which is really grim, because it's kind of like, if the future's a complete shithole, like, move to the metaverse. So maybe, sorry, that's a really long answer, but maybe that's why I think there was an interest in crypto now, but it's not really why I wrote the book. So why, I mean, is that what you would like to answer as your last question? Why now? for you, or what
I will
next?
vote
maybe?
if I take the final why now. Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I think there'd been the thing I'd read for a couple of years, which I'd mentioned James Bridle and Donella Meadows, and this very much this thing of systems are so complex, and we need like a way of engaging and like being literate with them, and that very much felt like, well, challenge accepted.
Yeah.
Then
I told you my colleague who wrote the systems book, I almost didn't want to I didn't want to share your book because I felt like he's on the verge of an existential crisis, and this is just going to tip him over the edge.
I mean, I'm happy to induce any existential crisis with my writing. But it had felt like that point. And also, I think, again, to come back to the Shannon Matten point of, not just making the invisible visible, but that kind of thing of if there isn't a way through, then it is almost that nihilistic, quasi-hyper-objectly, oh my God, it's so much how, what, why, you might as well just lie down in the sand and let the waves take you. And it's like, no, if we're going to engage with power, then we have to find a way through that. I think one of the things I mentioned quite early on is Joe Freeman's essay, The Tyranny of Structurelessness, where she says, if you assume that your structure there are no power structures within your organisation or your community, then you are still going to reinforce them. Like, power will move into a vacuum. It always will. So there was that part of, like, just because it is complex, but it is all around us, that was my the kind of like the engine at my ass to try and hammer through this one in that way. Shall we?
I think
so. On that amazing
Okay.
note. Thank you so much. We will be here for a bit. I have bookmarks and stickers. It would be lovely to say hi. But thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Georgina.
Thank you.
Thank you.